So today we're going to continue on and get into the time of the Prophet Muhammad himself, talk about the Arabian Peninsula, and we'll finish up with a short lesson in Arabic or Arabi, and talking about some things that are a little off the subject of the alphabet itself, but the nature of the culture and assignments. We're changing the assignment situation. But whatever, first of all, this class is not to be a class that's going to create a burden for anybody. I want you to enjoy it. I want you to get something out of it. That's more important than anything else. And the grade is, believe me, we'll work with you on getting you through this class so you get a decent grade. That's the important thing. Not trying to hammer anybody. I think it's just a privilege to have you in a class where you can study the Middle East and get involved with the subject that, honest to God, most Americans know nothing about. And that's really, so I'm thrilled this is developed. We have a few students missing today, but that usually happens. When I miss, they don't think I'm showing next time. That's because I'm 75, and usually they think if you're down with the count. They're waiting for the funeral announcement. But rumors of my demise are greatly exaggerated. Greatly exaggerated. So let me see, but who I still get even with those who take it seriously of the birth of Muhammad. We're talking about, and let me say something, I'm going to make something very clear here. When I refer to Muhammad, I will not simply say Muhammad. I will say the Prophet Muhammad. That's his proper name and title. And as you heard with, when Faisal gave his presentation, he stopped and would say, the Prophet Muhammad, blessings be upon him. This is proper title, proper courtesy, respect of the Prophet that's said all the time in the Middle East. Whenever they don't just say, hey, it's like George Washington, it's Washington. No, this is different. And so you have, I'm not sure, I've never been sure, never have been told correctly, one way or the other, dealing with this, how the average Muslim would look at someone talking about Muhammad by simply just saying Muhammad, or someone saying the Prophet Muhammad without saying blessings be upon him. I'm sure there are ways after almost a year in Egypt, I still never quite figured, because Egyptians would always say different things, and they would argue with you. Yes, but I said, but this is what you just said. Oh, no, I did not say that. Okay, that's Egyptians. They're always, yeah, question.
No, just a comment. I mean, when I was in Afghanistan, that we always referred to him as the Prophet Muhammad because we knew he was respectful.
Right.
If you just say Muhammad, like, wait,
that could be the guy next door.
Hey,
we have one in the class,
my
yeah.
buddy Muhammad down the street or something. But I mean, that's the problem.
It's like Jesus in Mexico.
Yeah, essentially.
All right. Getting back to this question, we get down to the 5th century AD. We had the last phase of the old Roman Empire was left. In the Western Roman Empire had fallen, the Eastern Roman Empire was all that was left, and that included this whole area here, right down through Egypt, parts of North Africa, Northern Arabia, Jordan. This was all part of the Eastern Roman Empire. It was a very religious empire, known as the Byzantine Empire. They enforced very strict orthodoxy. There was no separation of church and state in that empire, and it is largely Greek Orthodox in belief. They already had clashes with what had been the former Roman Empire of the West, the old Roman Empire, because the old Roman Empire did not accept any of the beliefs of the Orthodox Church. They were heading toward the evolution of Roman Catholicism. Not full-blown yet, but heading in that direction. By far, however, the Byzantine Empire's greatest rival was to the east, and that's a revived Persian Empire. Known as the Sasanian Empire sometimes, it has different names. It was Parthians and Sasanians. And it was the worship we talked about last time, the worship of Zoroastrianism, meaning the worship of a god of light, Ahura Mazda, and a god, not the worship of a god of evil, but recognition of a god of evil, named Angru Maidu. Yeah, the Japanese ought to make another car. They made the Mazda for Ahura Mazda to sell to Iran, but probably they should have made the Angru Maidu is some kind of a reverse rotary engine, reverse engineering with UFO qualifications, and you know, looks something like the Yugo. Ever seen the Yugo? Car made in Yugoslavia for maybe 10 years. It doesn't work, but that's the Angru Maidu. Okay. So Byzantium and Persia were at it all the time for control. This was a long, long story. It goes back to the Roman Empire, the classical Roman Empire, at war with the Parthians in the east. Constantly at warfare, right along the same border on the Euphrates River, between the Tigris-Euphrates River, constantly clashing. This rivalry had been in effect for probably five centuries, at least. And then we get down to the 6th century AD. A fresh rivalry had broken out, lasting about 40 years, which exhausted both sides. And I think, as I mentioned before, one of the issues that transpires here, a very important issue, is that the region of the Middle East, which was controlled by the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, had as one of its subject areas control of Egypt, and had been since the beginning. And this is what made the Eastern Roman Empire so powerful, was because of its control of Egypt's resources. Egypt has still had a large supply of gold from southern Egypt and the Sudan. They were the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, meaning they had continual massive wheat production from the Nile Valley every year. When the rains came, you had the flooding of the Nile, things that don't happen today. You had the flood of the Nile, and you had the seasons come and go, but you had vast amounts of food coming that became basically what everybody depended on in the Eastern Mediterranean. They bought Egyptian wheat, they bought Egyptian legumes, they bought Egyptian, any products that came out of Egypt. Egypt's very wealthy. Old country with a great old tradition. But also their form of Christianity was different. And this becomes the issue. Their Christianity was called Coptic Christianity, which is just a word that means Egyptian Christianity, because Coptic is just another word for Egyptian. But the form of Christianity goes back probably to the 2nd century. First of all, they claim their connection to Christianity came through the writer of the second gospel. His name is Mark the Evangelist. Mark. So Saint Mark becomes the patron saint of Egypt. And they had as one of their great heroes very early in their existence, by the 3rd century, a young clergyman named Athanasius. This sounds a bit highly technical, but don't worry about it. I have to spell it. Athanasius, Athanasius. Athanasius was a clergyman of somewhat unknown rank. I see it sometimes he's called the Bishop of Alexandria. Sometimes I hear it was just a priest in Alexandria. But he took a stand in the 3rd century, which makes him a hero. against one of the great heresies of the early church, and that was the heresy of Bishop Arius, A-R-I-A-S. And I don't want to get too technical with all this stuff, but it's kind of important. It was important why Egypt very early became attached to the very early growing, fledgling Muslim kingdom, or Muslim empire in the early stages, because of its collision with the Byzantine Empire on the question of doctrine and on the question of politics. The Egyptians were going to go it alone. They hated the Byzantine, absolutely hated the Byzantine. So, but on this question, the Egyptians took a stand against this, with Athanasius, took a stand against what's called Arianism, which suggested that Jesus was a creation, was never God, but was a creation of God. God created him as Christ, as the Messiah, after he was born. He was born human and then created as a God by the activity. God superimposed his power on Jesus and therefore created him as a special entity. Athanasius, who was lower in rank than Arius, living in Egypt at the time, thought about that a lot. Now, I think to anybody listening to this who's not a Christian, or anybody who is a Muslim and not really paying attention to this, or if you happen to be Jewish and say, I don't believe in this at all, any of it, fine. But to the 3 to 4 million Christians living in Egypt, this is big stuff. Now, here is the issue. Athanasius said, if Jesus is not God, then it cost God nothing to die for the sins of mankind. Because basic Christian belief is that Jesus is God, and therefore it cost God everything to die for the sins of man. It was a true death and so forth. The heretical view is that that basically God created Christ out of Jesus, period. And therefore he could do it with anybody. So it didn't cost God anything to die for the sins of mankind. Athanasius says, that's total heresy. I won't support this. I'll die before I ever support this. And it turns out at the great council of one of the councils at Nicaea, N-I-C-E-A, the church decided in favor of Athanasius. So when I was in Cairo, I went to St. Mark's Cathedral, and there they had a fragment, a relic, of the finger of Athanasius at the cathedral. It was the new St. Mark's Cathedral. And I didn't understand a word of the service. It's done in old Egyptian, Coptic. It's the ritual language of the Coptic church, of Egyptian church. It's essentially ancient Egyptian. And it's sort of like you're going to worship Amun-Ra, not Christ. I mean, it just has a whole different feel to it. But fascinating. Okay. Because of this belief and their own peculiar belief that the nature of the person of Christ has a fusion of the divine and the human together, is just one nature, one person. There's a term for it. It's called, it's a view that basically, I don't think I'll even get into it, but because it really gets complicated. I don't want to get everybody all screwed up here with this stuff. But basically, it's contrary to the normal view of either Orthodoxy or Roman Catholicism, who believe traditionally that Christ has two natures, fully human, fully divine, that are not to be confused and not fused together. In the Coptic view, it's one. It becomes one nature. The term is used as monophysite, M-O-N-O-P-H-Y-S-I-T-E. Now, all this gets a little hairy, and if you really want to get hairy, go to theology school. I had somebody ask me what they wanted me to recommend them to go to some theological seminary. They wanted me to teach them Greek, Koine Greek, which I used to know. Can't speak it. It's totally, it's readable and totally worthless in any context. Because when I went to Greece, I couldn't speak a word of Greek, but I could read the street signs. I knew where I was. But I didn't know why I was there.
So now you know why you're here, but you don't know
I
why
have
you
no
are.
idea. It doesn't matter anymore. I'm past the age king where it counts. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. So anyway. So the monophysite position really aggravated the Byzantines. And so very soon after this, the Byzantines constantly persecuted the Egyptian Christians. So the Egyptian Christians said, you know, we've had enough of this. They named their own pope. And when I was in Egypt, I got to meet the Pope. At that time, that was Pope Shenouda. He's now dead. I forgot the new Pope. And then we also met the Sheikh Al-Hazar, the leader of the Muslims in Egypt and one of the great theological clerics. And that was just, and we met them about a week apart. And you're looking at the real rival clash today in Egypt between Coptic Christians and their Pope. And I don't think the Sheikh Al-Hazar is looking for trouble. He just has to deal with Muslim brothers occasionally. And by the way, we just cut aid to Egypt.
Yeah.
I think that's a big mistake.
Big mistake.
It is. It's just totally stupid. There's no reason to do this. What are we trying to prove? We're trying to prove that we believe in democratic process. But everybody knows that Mohammed Morsi, who was probably my former student at USC, in fact stole the election. So it was not an honest and fair election by any sense of the word, and everybody knew it at the time. How soon that has been forgotten. Anyway, my view is in the old military hatred between the Muslim brothers and the military party, it's gone on for 60 years, since the end of World War II, when they first tried to assassinate Nasser. And then they finally assassinated Sadat. And they've killed a lot of people over the years. Now, not all Muslim brothers are probably alike, but at the same time, this is a very, it's strict application of this Quranic law, but their interpretation of Quranic law. It's not just by agreement, there's no modules, there's no coming together, there's no committee saying this is what it is, you're going to believe it this way. And Egyptians they knew where this was going by midsummer. This was going into a sort of a theocratic dictatorship. Theocratic meaning what? The rule of God, dictatorship of the rule of God, a la the viewpoint of the Muslim brothers. And I met a number of the brothers when I was in Egypt. They were around, and they were very confrontational. They really wanted to know what you were doing there, what you thought of their country, and then they begin the interrogation, and you're surrounded. You're literally surrounded in there, and you go, oh shit, I'm in trouble. You know? And I was with a bunch of people on this Fulbright program from the United States, and we were at the Saudi Arabian Exposition held on the east side of Cairo, huge thing. And it was just great to go to it. And then you step outside to take a breather, and because everybody's smoking, but you step outside to take a breather, and then that's when the brothers would come around you. If they saw you were from somewhere else, like America, not their favorite people. They want to know. And most of them were engineers, tons of engineers, out of work, no jobs, no future, no nothing. You know.
Let's build a new dam.
Yeah. Well, let's tear down the old one first. So yeah, but I won't forget. I won't forget the confrontation, how it was, where it was going. And I thought when the summer in June, when they overthrew the brothers and put Morsi and Holding somewhere, that this was just another in that long stage, that long collision between these two groups. Because the first thing that they did that really aggravated the military was begin the process of slowly trying to disarm the Egyptian military, cut back on their supplies, and the military is saying, okay, we know where this is going. And we ain't going. So it's really been, it's an interesting situation. But what do they want to do in Egypt just to get off this issue? Hopefully, in about a year, the military wants to reestablish the election process. And get some democratic parties, fledgling parties going. It's going to take a year to get that secure. The military has absolutely no vested interest in trying to control the country themselves. Egypt has had a parliament since 1881. It's been subjected to by the British for a long period of time. Then it was subjected by the Revolutionary Party that came out of World War II, and they held power for at least 3 presidents. It's time for change. But it's not time to substitute a dictatorship for a theocratic dictatorship. That's, in my opinion. They need some breathing room, and we need to support it. Quit forcing around this stuff. Okay, that's just my opinion.
But isn't it Saudi Arabia said that if the Americans...
They're gonna step in and
No,
support
they said
them.
they'll give more.
I know,
actually,
yeah.
A lot.
Well, we could use the money these days.
Yeah, probably.
Maybe they'll
Okay.
give us some aid too.
Yeah, how about, can we take a collection? Let's go to Saudi Arabia and take a collection. Right. Let's go to Putin, take a collection. Okay, so the Byzantines had this collision with the Coptic Church in Egypt, and that made the Coptic Church very, very, I'd say, open to change, to get rid of the Byzantines. Okay. Looking at the Arabian Peninsula at the same period of time, what is its role in the history of civilization in this part of the world? It's more remote, frankly. There's a remote feature to it. The Arabian Peninsula was never at the heart of any of these civilizations. It was always on the fringes, on the margins, and therefore developed a very separate culture. And you had 2 groups that are going to emerge here. The Bedouin Arab, who is considered the pure form of Arab tradition, pure form of the language, culture, living in these remote areas, but they're still looked to as still having the heart of Arab culture. Is from the Arab Bedouin. But you also, B-E-D-O-U-I-N. B-E-D-O-U-I-N. How many saw the movie Lawrence of Arabia? Remember the UK? That's who takes him across the desert of the Bedouin. Sorry, they're Hashemite Bedouin. But they take him across. They know the area. And the other would be the town Arab. Arabs of the towns, mostly on the coast, not too many towns inland. Now, this civilization has had a background of living off of trade, north and south. What's north and what's south? What's north had been the Byzantine Empire, before that the Roman Empire, before that the Hellenistic Empire of Alexander the Great, before that you had the great empires of Babylon and so forth, Assyria, Babylon, Persia. Empires to the north that are getting trade from south of the Arabian Peninsula. South of the Arabian Peninsula, the trade runs from essentially Mediterranean and Eastern Europe through the Arabian Peninsula south into the Yemen and across the Red Sea into Ethiopia. Now, what is involved in the trade? Most of the trade that is probably, I'd say, the expensive, the trade that really makes the money, has to do with the spice trade, some ivory, spices like frankincense, myrrh. These come from used in biblical times, and still very, very popular. You have a vast amount of ivory trade. You have some gold trade coming from Ethiopia via Central Africa, up in that region. It's going across up the peninsula, on the side of the Arabian Peninsula, into Byzantine period. Before that, the Roman period, the Hellenistic period, the Persians before that, and so forth. You have this trade going back and forth. In other words, this whole area has been for a long time very much tied to not manufacturing, but trade. the heart and soul, the caravan trade, back and forth trade. Also very, very strong attachment to trade going east and west, from the world of the Mediterranean all the way east to India, Indonesia, China, to a certain extent, Japan. Trade coming from Japan, China, India, Indonesia, going westward. Now how does that work? What that does, by the time you go through all the trading partners and the connective tissue in the Arabian Peninsula, you have a tremendous amount of money that's being made because of the markup in the trade. One of the most valuable aspects of this trade is something people don't even think about, but that's the spice trade from Indonesia. Cloves, nutmeg, mace. The spice trade from India itself, cinnamon and pepper. This sold on the Western market 10 times the price that it sold for to the Arab middlemen, the Arab traders. This is the way the living was made. And without it, you wouldn't have without this middleman connection, there would have been no trade between east and west, and very little between north and south. So the Arabs had a very valuable role here in terms of the trade. Now, the true early trading kingdoms that developed on this peninsula received very little historical mention, but they're significant, and they had long term. They were long term. They were as sophisticated as any of the civilizations around them. The first one is the old kingdom in the south, on the Yemeni border with the Arabian Peninsula, on the Yemeni border with Saudi Arabia today. It's known as Sabah. How many have heard of Sabah? Okay. Spelled S-E-B-A. It's spelled in Aramaic as Sheba. It is the source of the story of the Queen of Sheba. She comes from Sabah. We never know what her name is, but it goes back to about at least 1000 BC. And we're talking about a population of maybe far bigger than it is today, that specific area, of about 100,000 people. Why? Because they had built a very highly successful and sophisticated dam from the runoff of water from the wadis that run into that area. It's not a river system as such. You don't have a single continual flowing river, but you have during the flood season, two months of heavy rains and flooding, and the wadis carry the river, and they found a way to harness that with a huge dam. That lasted over 500 years, and they built a very large city in the area that has the connection to the Queen of Sheba. Well, that's why it's called Sabah. It also has a connection across the Red Sea to Abyssinia. Ancient Abyssinia had connections to Sabah. So this is a pretty vast, sophisticated trade connection and trading empire, basically what it is. It lasts until we think about 600 AD. It's 500 or 600 BC. We're not sure. We know what happened. We know there is a rupture in the dam, and the crops are all destroyed. It's the beginning of the end of the civilization. When the dam breaks, they have no way to repair this thing. It's just too much of a nightmare to try and do it. We don't, what we can say is that it happened so fast that it was simply too much of an effort to try and correct it at that point in a single generation. They couldn't deal with it in a single generation. And so that civilization sort of just disappears. To the north, you have another Arab civilization known as the Nabatean, N-A-B-A-T-E-A-N. N-A-B-A-T-E-A-N. Nabatea was a pretty vast Arab trading kingdom, if it was a kingdom, in northwest Arabia, on what today is the border of Jordan. And what is left of that tells us just how vast this thing was, sophisticated this thing was. This is where you come up with the city of Edom, known by some old scholars as the Rose Red City of the Dead. You go inside the canyon, and you come into the Nabatean kingdom, or known also as Idumea. And you walk in there, and it's all rose red, and these massive buildings carved out of the solid rock. Just unbelievable. I mean, it's as staggering to look at that as anything in Egypt. You walk in, and you go, what? It's overpowering. And this was a very sophisticated trading kingdom that nobody knows much about. There are inscriptions there, but we can't read them. Did you spend any time in Jordan?
You just pass through.
Just pass through? Okay. That's what I said when I went through Vegas, but it didn't. I'm just passing through. But I lost my wallet. I must have slowed down. So you have this really sophisticated kingdom, of which we know nothing about, really. It's an amazing place, and I highly recommend if you ever get a chance to go. But remember, it's established by Arab traders. It goes back to about 1000 BC, again, like Saba. So what we had 1000 BC was that these two, Saba and the Nabatean kingdom, had connections, trade connections. And they dealt with Rome, they dealt with the Greeks, they dealt with the Persians, and they dealt with Ethiopia, Abyssinia in the south, and they also dealt with India, Indonesia, China, and maybe possibly Japan. This is the old trading network. By the time we get to the period now under discussion, roughly the 6th century AD, the period of just before the birth of the Prophet Muhammad. In the Arabian Peninsula, the cities under discussion that are still very vital, very important, were the cities of Mecca, Medina. We say Mecca, they say Makkah. Medina, Taif. There's some other ones that I want to talk to, not that important, but you will have a number of cities all involved in trade. The trade is what's important. You have the two distinct cultures, the culture of the Bedouin, still, and the culture of the townsperson. In the culture of the Bedouin, you had, first of all, among the Bedouin tribes living in the regions tied to trade, many of these tribes had their own dialect. They all could read the same script. The Arabic language had already matured into as far as reading it or writing it, written Arabic was already very uniform, alike everywhere. But as far as how it's spoken, very different from location to location. The dialects were quite different. And I love this in Egypt all the time. The Egyptians were always correcting everybody. And then when we have visitors from Saudi Arabia, they would correct the Egyptians and say, no, la, la, la. You don't know what you're talking about. And so, anyway, it was always an argument. Always, just always was.
Still.
We had people that were specialists in the Arabic. I wasn't a specialist in the Arabic language. I was there to study what the British did, which really made me tired. What are you here for? To study what the British did? God, are you sick? Yeah, could say so. But we used to have these arguments, and we had a girl from, God, what was her name? I saw her on television recently. Annie. And I always called her Apple Annie. She was from the University of Chicago. She had completed her PhD in Arabic studies, the language, and was pretty fluent speaking it. But she had studied classical Quranic Arabic for a number of years. She could really read and write this stuff. But the Egyptians loved to correct her. And they just do this out of just bang like that. And she'd say, you ignorant dipshit. You telling me how to speak this? Can you read the Quran? No, I can't read. I can't read or write, but I'm telling you, you're wrong. So on and on, Annie. So one time when we went to see the Sheikh Al-Hazar, she was one of 2 women that were with us together. And of course, they wore the veil, with the Sheikh, that's protocol. And we were all asking questions. And we'd asked, most of us were asking in English, and sitting next to the Sheikh was his translator, immediate instant translation. And I mean, that's a whole process. It's something that you don't see in this country, anything like it. This kind of translation, exact translation. Into classical Arabic, not Egyptian dialect Arabic, but classical Arabic. And so, and then he'd respond, and then the translator would give it back to us in answer in English. What do we think of you as foreign aid? I mean, stupid questions that aren't going to get you in trouble, okay? You stay away from politics, you know? And Annie raised her hand, and the translator pointed, okay, take the question. And instead of asking the question in English, which she should have done, she asked it in local colloquial Egyptian Arabic. You know, Hollywood Arabi. And directly, not to the translator, but directly to the Sheikh. I'm thinking, Annie, how long have you been studying this stuff? And why would you do this? This is not protocol. And he looked at it was hysterical. He looked at the translator and he says, "You'll have to translate, I don't understand." he would not accept this question. And she says, so after it's over, an hour later we got out alive, and so we're asking Annie, what are you thinking? She says, listen, he knew exactly what I was saying, and he's not going to answer me. But do you think he talks to his wife when he has to go shopping, grocery shopping, in classical Arabic to go get the groceries? I'm thinking, Annie, that's not the point. The point is there's protocol here, and you should, of all people, should know this. You've been studying this stuff forever. We're just novices compared to your knowledge of the language. But and then I see her on TV about 3 weeks ago. Still had red hair, still the aggressive personality. The whole thing is still there. A little older, but I thought, oh my God, she's still alive. She made it through that year. Anyway, Egypt was just a fabulous experience for him anyways. So, getting back to again, you talk about the Bedouin tribes, classical Arabic, and that's how I got off on that, was already there, but the oral traditions were used in dialects that were very, very different from one from another. But you do have this long tradition of classical Arabic with a very strong poetic edge to it, very strong in poetry, big time, as something that's very rich and part of the heritage. The Arabic language itself is related to all the other Semitic languages in the region. Aramaic, at that time, before that, ancient Assyrian, Babylonian, and Akkadian. But you have a whole slew of these languages that thank God for Arabic, because you can work your way from the Arabic language back into these other Semitic languages, and that's how we were able to translate those languages and find out what they said. Well, that stuff that goes way back, about 3000 BC, is the use of Arabic. Hebrew, that's true to a lesser degree. It's a related Semitic language that's been reborn with the state of Israel. It's mandated the use of Hebrew, classic Hebrew, ancient Hebrew. We're not sure how close it is. The big difference there is that there are no vowels in the written language today. And you said something about each word has like three letters to it. And same thing in Hebrew, 3 letters, almost identical, same kind of thing. So these languages are somewhat close, but not entirely. It's like, well, I'd say it's probably a big difference. quite a big difference. Enough so that people that speak Arabic do not really readily decide to speak Hebrew. They're not encouraged anyway to do this. And people that speak Hebrew are not encouraged to speak Arabic. So they really don't know just how close those parts of those languages are. But I was looking at the alphabet you have, and some of the things are very close to Hebrew, very, very close. Like the sheen, seen, sheen, thou, you have the double S and then the SH and some of that stuff. Very, very close, but other things absolutely, totally different, you know. And you were talking about the TD sound, which is almost impossible for anybody from my hemisphere to pronounce. Tried it, doesn't work. Okay. Now, in the Arabian Peninsula, you have cities that are there on the coast involved in trade. Mecca and Medina were the biggest. And at Mecca, you had already a worship that had been tied to Mecca for a long period of time. And the chief deity, the chief god at Mecca was the god Allah at the Kaaba. He's there, he's worshipped, but there's no revelation about him. The Quran is not written yet, but there's already the worship going on in some phase. That worship is controlled by an inside group there, the tribe of the Quraysh, and at one stage it's called the Quraysh of the inside. These are the major players, the wealthy businessmen, the caravan owners, and so forth, that have the highest stake. And they are the protectors of the Kaaba and the protectors of the worship of Allah, the Kaaba, and there's also other gods attached to this, or a number of gods attached to this worship. So it is not strict, it's not monotheism yet. You have a lot of polytheism there at that time. And the polytheism and the worship is connected to the trade. Caravan trade comes through there all the time, and you have as part of the caravan trade that the major players that are bringing the trade are going to worship at the Kaaba, are going to bring gifts and offerings, they're going to bring money, they're going to make offerings, and so forth. So the worship as it went on with the polytheistic worship at the Kaaba was very much tied to trafficking in money exchange. You are tied to this and it's lucrative. What if somebody comes along and says, hey, this is really wrong. Polytheism is wrong, you're worshiping all these gods, they don't really belong here. How long do you think he's going to last? Or how popular is he going to be? Not. Because he's cutting into a major arena of funding that's really lucrative to the Quraysh of the inside, the Quraysh of the outside, and others involved in the trade. It makes Mecca a very wealthy trade city. It's a wealthy bourgeoisie city. It's like a merchant city in Italy during the Renaissance. You have that same kind of ethos to it. And you had something very similar going on in Medina, but not with all the gods. But in Medina you have, again, you have worship set up. You have a vast trading connection, Mecca, Medina, and then the trade going up to Syria, up to Damascus, or south down to the Yemen. Vast amount of trade because everybody would bring gifts and offerings into this arena. Two of the other gods that are mentioned there are Uzat and Alat, but the chief deity was always Allah. So you can see sort of the natural way in which at some point, when the Prophet Muhammad begins to talk about the God who reveals himself to him, And he knows it's a God that has already spoken to Abraham, to Moses, traditional one God, that he's certain this is the same God that's spoken to him. But he does not right away see the connection that the God that's speaking to him is necessarily Allah, the Kaaba. But eventually he does see this. And that becomes very clear in the Quran. Okay. So, at the time that Muhammad was born, there was a war going on called the War of the Wicked. We don't know much about it. It's a trade war in the Arabian Peninsula. And you have the War of the Wicked, and this is an attempt to sabotage some of the caravan trade and other things. A number of the tribes will be involved in this war. And you have emerging out of this war a group called the League of the Virtuous. The League of the Virtuous. This league later will have personnel and people in it that will readily identify themselves with the cause of the Prophet Muhammad. So the caravan trade can become very volatile. It has a lot connected to it in terms of maintaining the wealth of the area. I'd say for the most part, in the city of Mecca, for instance, I think this was carried on pretty reasonably well for a long period of time, without a lot of interference, without a lot of warfare, without a lot of conflict. Eventually it's going to happen. But what is amazing is just how complex this whole thing was, and the fact that it survived it so well as it did for a long period of time. It's a city that really had a remarkable experience which nobody really knew about. Who did they deal with in terms of the closest civilizations? Well, they had dealt with Rome. Later they're going to deal with the Byzantines. Trade connections are there, but neither the Romans or the Byzantines really say much about the city of Mecca. There are almost no representatives from either the Byzantines or formerly before the Romans into that region. As far southwest as the Romans ever got in terms of dealing with the Middle East, they call one small area Arabia Felix. Arabia Felix, which means happy Arabia. I'm not sure what that means, but Arabia Felix turns out to be the area of Jordan. So they were dealing with the Nabateans. That's who they were dealing with. They weren't dealing directly with Mecca, Medina. Now, in the city of Medina, you have a different situation than you do with Mecca. The city of Medina was largely populated by a Jewish immigration that came from the destruction of Israel after 70 and then 120 AD. That destruction resulted in the Jewish diaspora, and some of that diaspora came to the city of Medina. We also know that there were a number of Arab converts to Judaism in that city, so it's unique. Now, looking at the position of the Bedouin tribes around, Bedouin Arabs had a long tradition of each tribe having their own god. Sometimes manifested by a stone, and you carry the stone around with you in a special container as the tribe moves on the caravan trade or moving from location to location. You may carry it into battle. The protector of the god of the tribe was the sheikh, or the sheikh's family. Surrounded this thing, protected this thing. This was their duty to do it. So if you were, and the connection between the god of the tribe and the sheikh and the family was very, very, it's almost one thing. You have the tribal connection, you have the loyalty to the tribe, and your belief in the god of that tribe. Belief systems and tribal loyalty were basically one and the same. So if you decided that you no longer believed in the tribal god or would support the tribal god, that not only was understood as apostasy or heresy, but that's also understood as treason. In other words, this is a huge point. There is no separation of church and state in Islam. There really isn't. I mean, you can talk about that all you want, but basically, and the Muslim brothers can talk about, they want to bring it all together. It's already together. Church and state are already together in the sense that Islam and the state and the kingdoms are together. They are one. You don't deny one and then support the other. It doesn't work that way. Now, if I'm not saying this correctly, help me. But, okay? Or as your friend would say, are you the man? Okay, any questions about this? So the tribe will carry around the stones. Where have you seen this before? In the early Jewish religion, they carried the tabernacle with them. That's when the tribes of Israel were operating as tribes, as Bedouin tribes. Moving from Egypt finally into Canaan, across the River Jordan, they brought the tabernacle with them. This is not an uncommon tradition. All right. The area, just about the time of the birth of the Prophet Muhammad, was now seen as a collision point between the Persian Empire and the Byzantine Empire. You have religious rivalries, you have political rivalries, and so what both the Byzantines and the Persians were doing were finding ways of making allies or colonizing small towns and cities in the Arabian Peninsula to checkmate one another. So you had this collision of, what would I say, hegemony. Each one struggling through the Arabian Peninsula to try to get a hold here, strategic hold. And at that time, we come to the period of major warfare breaking out between them, and the time of the birth of the Prophet Muhammad, right at that juncture. Okay, who can tell me when he was born? I know you know.
662?
Pretty close. But that's using AD, which you guys don't use. Okay, he was born in, well, how do you say that? It's not AH. It's before AH. So, okay, we'll kind of hang on. Anyway, it's in the late 6th century. He's born as a practically orphan at the time of his birth. He's born to from what some analysis is, to an outside member of the Quraysh of the outside, not the inside, but the outside. Ultimately, his father dies before Muhammad's even born, before the Prophet Muhammad's born, and then he's taken care of, and his mother dies when he's 6 years old, and then he's adopted by a grandfather, and ultimately by an uncle whose name was Abu Talib, T-A-L-I-B, who's going to raise him and offer protection, because as an orphan you need the protection. I bet I know who that is. I know who that is. Welcome, welcome. You're just in time for the Arabic lesson.
Beautiful.
So Abu Talib is his uncle. Abu Talib is a member of the Hashemite clan of Hashim, which is going to be around, it's still around today.
What plan?
The Kingdom of Jordan. Okay. At least that's what they claim. These guys go, oh man, the Jordanians. But it seems like they're claiming. I think the claim is valid. Okay, now. But the action really starts when he gets involved with the trade. His uncle trains him in the trade. He will go from Mecca up into Damascus on that trade. He's going to become very good at this by the time he's 20 years old. And then he goes through a life-changing experience in the year 595. What happens with 595? What changes your life?
Marriage?
Marriage. Believe me, it's a life changer. You may not think so. But just give it a shot. Just give it a shot. Find out what it is, but don't do it. Okay? What is this thing? Okay. And then you find out, you go, oh my God, I didn't know. He married a wealthy widow by the name of Khadija. And based on the fact that he took control of, she offered him a situation where he could go prove himself on the trade routes to Syria. He did very well in negotiation. He gained a reputation for really being very much above board, very honest. And the reputation was well founded. He had that people wanted to trade with Muhammad. They wanted to have good trade with him, good relations, and he was always very generous in the trading negotiations. But it gave him a great reputation. And when she finally said, this is the man. So she actually proposes to him. So you guys can wait for that if you like. That's how I got married. I got proposed to at the Cabaret Theater. I thought, this is the way to go. It saves a lot of embarrassment and it saves a no. So I'll just, okay. It's wonderful. Anyway, and then the caravan trade, it's very lucrative, and there's always been a question here as to whether or not that Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, whether or not he could read or write. And I'm inclined to believe that he could to some degree, but at the same time, there's so much in terms of trade that was taking place as part of a handshake and an oral, it's oral. Your word is your word. And you know what the facts and figures are because you have this, what I would call this instantaneous memory where you remember absolutely everything, commit everything to memory. So you know what the negotiations are, you know what the prices are, you know what you're going to pay, or you know what they're going to pay you, and they're going to do it. You don't have to read and write. You don't have to have paper there. You don't have to have a contract. Contracts in your heart, contracts in your brain and your heart. And that was the way a lot of it was done. So it's not necessary that he had to read and write. My guess is he could have. But later, this is one of the claims that when he receives the Quran, when he receives the recitation from the angel Gabriel, and all these things are written down, I thought, well, he wouldn't have had time to write all that down. He had to have help. And so you had a secretary available. Some say it's because he could not read and write. There's a whole debate still out there about this. And I don't know if it makes any difference, basically. I mean, I don't know that Jesus could read or write. Don't know. Nobody knows. Moses, we think, could, because he's told, write this down. Number 1, thou shalt not kill. Oh, okay. So, yeah.
So in his Prophet Muhammad's travels to Damascus, he would stop often in Jerusalem. And is that where he was introduced to the teachings of Jesus? Or?
I don't know. I don't know. There's nothing in the record about him stopping in Jerusalem, but he has a night vision in a night journey called the Isra to Jerusalem.
Okay.
And that's where he comes down on
the rock.
The rock, right? Exactly, rock. And you have the mosque there today, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Temple Mount is there. Everything's there. It's hard to explain that one, but yeah, I don't know if he went to Jerusalem anyway, in terms of caravan trade. I don't think there's anything in the material that suggests that he did or didn't. It's up to your own reading to figure that out. Don't know. But then, after some 15 years of marriage, he begins to receive in a cave outside of Mecca, revelations from God, and it is a revelation which he later states is the revelation from the angel Gabriel, which gives him the ultimate revelation, which is the Quran, which we today know is the holy book of the Quran. Quran means recitation or to recite. And it's unlike the Christian or Jewish belief in divine inspiration. Which means that the idea that God breathed this a book into existence, something like that, where you have the inspiration of a prophet, or you have basically God inspires this thing. The Quran does a different thing. It is direct dictation. Every word is the word of God. Every word. Every word. And with all of the subtleties there, every word is the exact word of God, directly from the angel Gabriel to the Prophet Muhammad, and he recites the word loud, and the secretary writes it down as it comes. And that's why you still have that tradition in the Middle East of that kind of communication. It's sacred. So it's direct dictation, it's divine dictation, it's not just inspiration. So it's a different thing. It's much more literal, and therefore it must be kept in the same exact language format as it came in originally, which is in classical Arabic. So the service, go to a mosque and you hear the service, you hear the reading of the Quran, but it must be from the classical Arabic. Now the sermon might be given in a colloquial Arabic, modern, but the reading of the word is always in the classical Arabic. And that's going to be true in any mosque, throughout the world. This is very, very, very important. All right. Out of this comes which is something that he did not anticipate, although he had a reputation that was a very, very positive reputation. But out of this comes this, the issue of now what? I mean, what does all this mean? And I think very early you have this is not a gradual revelation. This is like bang, it hits all at once. It's all, just sort of comes very big to him. And as he begins to recite these things, if you look at the Quran, one of the things I find really amazing how it happens, the early surahs are like this big. Early, you might call each one a chapter surah, and then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and finally it becomes enormous. But that even to pull that off in a gradual way is rather amazing. So you need to get a copy of the Quran of some kind. I don't care what, even if you can't read it, even in Arabic, but get it in English, you can still see how it works. It goes from little to big to big to big to grand to huge, and it's an amazing process. What the language is, the typical language of the 6th century AD, and it is a language that talks about, number one, there is one God only. It talks about the repudiation of polytheism. Into polytheism it must go. That everybody will be judged for good or evil at the end. And you have your choice of paradise or hell, depending on how you play it. But people must make a choice. As these things are being recited, one has to ask the question: well, what is this? Does this relate to anything else? Yes, it relates to Judaism and Christianity in many ways. because you're talking about the same God. Now, I don't know, the thing is, here comes the question. As the Prophet Muhammad receives these vibrations and the words, does he know? Does he think this is a separate God or not? Is this something brand new? Or does he tend to put this together, associated with God speaking to Abraham way back, God speaking to Moses, that is the Jewish revelation, God speaking to Jesus? Does he see these things as having a connection? And I think, of course, I mean, if you and I were going through the same thing, let's say we're all human here, we go, something like this happens, that's the first thing you want to know, is who's doing the talking, who's speaking to me, you know? Could be a jinn, you don't know. But so you have to compare, you've got to know enough about it. Well, he does have, his wife is very supportive. She has a cousin, Warek, I think his name is, and he is a Christian, but he tended to support Muhammad and say, you know, what the thing's happening to you is just like what happened, God had with Moses. God's speaking to you, man. You know, this is the same God. So what you see here is the evolution of a revolution that's under the revelation that's considered a continuation of the ongoing revelation of God that begins much earlier in history. He does not see it as a separate God giving a separate revelation. It's the same God, but this is the continual revelation, and it's the final revelation, the end of it all. This is the last of it. God spoke to Moses, God spoke to the prophets, God spoke to Jesus, and now this is the final revelation. He does not come on and say, no, this is a different God, different revelation. He sees the continuity. And I think that's the important thing. I think that today Christians and Jews need to look at, we look at Islam. We need to say that there is, how a Muslim looks at this is continuity. Yes, there's going to be differences, but there is that continuity. It's not understood as a separate God. Okay? Now, you also have then I'm going to stop. Turn it over to you. Okay. You also have at the very end of this thing that you have the religion as it becomes revealed is known as Islam. Actually, Islam, rather than Islam. And it means submission. You change the word around a little bit, you have the word Muslim. Because a Muslim is one who is submitted. Submitted to what? Submitted to the words of the Quran, submitted to the will of God. So everything in life that happens, there's nothing in life that happens that is not the will of God. Everything is the will of God. So out of this comes, we'll talk about this next time, the 5 pillars of Islam. The things that are mandated, the visible things that we can do that are part of the visible will of God that each one does. It's very succinct. Nothing subtle about it. It's in your face. It's easy to follow. The 5 pillars. Easiest one being what? Pray 5 times a day. Well, sometimes that's not always easy, especially in Cairo. You get killed. You stop to pray, you're dead. Okay. Hit by a truck. Okay.
Traffic.
Oh, yeah, geez. That's the last thing I remember.